listening to Lola, it sounds like, you were probably expecting a dinosaur or something. It sounds like I have a very long record sheet. And I started late in translation. I did something completely different for the first few years of my professional life. You probably wouldn't know that, but I was a hairdresser. So, after hairdressing, went into translation, language professions, went to school, ended up at the Sorbonne. So my autobiography will be from the salon to the Sorbonne. First I'd like to, I think I'm going to move over here because I want to follow my notes, but I want to be able to be heard. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. So, first of all, thank you, Lola, for inviting me. It's very good to be here today, to be here among friends. Friends that I've known for many years and friends that I've yet to meet. So it's a great pleasure to be here among language professionals. I spend like Lola said, I'm at Ryerson University. I chair the language department. Most of my days are spent explaining why we need the language department and what is translation and why we need to teach translation. So it's very refreshing to be here among peers where I don't have to justify my existence. Over, I think about a year and a half ago, half a year ago, Lola called me and said, well, would you be interested in coming and talk to us at our next conference? And I said, right now, I would say no, because I was right in the middle of organizing the Congress for Humanities and Social Sciences at Ryerson. We had 10,000 people coming to a campus, so I was a little bit busy. But I said, yes, okay, I'll do it. Call me again later and I'll do it. And then she called me and I'd forgotten about it a little bit. So I'm very happy to be here, very happy to bring you a bit of a different kind of message for me anyway. I usually don't use foul language too much. I don't use vulgar language too much. I don't use taboos too much, I think. But today we'll be talking about taboos, and I hope that you're ready for it. I'm sure you'll be able to handle it, but just in case, I'm going to press this, there you go, may contain language that will be offensive to some. So audience discretion is advised. There are some crude words that will be coming eventually. As professionals, I'm sure you will be just fine. So speaking of professionals, can you tell me what are, in your opinion, the qualities that make someone a language professional? Not the skills, but the qualities. We know that we have to be fluent in 2 languages, 2 cultures, but what are the qualities?
Detail-orientated.
Details. Flexible. Detail orientation.
Punctual.
Open-minded. Open-minded. Thank you. Yes. Adaptive. Yes.
Good listening skills.
Good listening skills. Absolutely. We have to be able to let people talk. Yes.
Impartial.
Partial. Impartial. I was going to say partial. Impartial. Yes, absolutely. Neutral, impartial. Yes.
Good concentration.
Good concentration.
Good short-term memory.
Good short-term memory. Yes. Good. So, yes, exactly. Stamina. Yes. Especially if you're supposed to be interpreting for 2 hours and it's, you're into hour 5 and there's no one to come to relieve you. Yeah, stamina would be a good thing to have. Or translation, when you get a rush at 5 o'clock and it's for the next morning, you have 5,000 words for the next morning, you're there, okay, I can do this, all right, good. And curious, yeah, this is one of the things that I think our students lack the most, I think, these days, is that they are curious about certain things, but not curious enough to go deeper into the subject. They'll read things and say, oh, that's interesting. But they don't have the curiosity to go deeper into the subject, which is a good quality to have as a language professional. So, as language professionals, we're always told, be We must convey the message, and that's always a little bit murky. We must convey the message to the best of our ability. That's also a little bit vague. But our responsibility is to do justice to the text or to the conversation or to the dialogue. I will be using translation, interpreting interchangeably unless I want to talk about one of the practices more specifically, but please don't be offended if I say translation when I mean interpreting, or you think I should be saying interpreting and vice versa. But in order to do justice to a text or to a conversation or to a communication event, we must constantly ask ourselves, how the interlocutors, and that's the way I would use it, how would it work if I weren't there? What would they say if I weren't there? What would they say? How would they communicate with each other if there weren't a language barrier? If they were able to talk to one another effectively. And sometimes you wonder, you think those people cannot communicate with one another. I mean, it's a good thing I'm here. I'm saving their lives, and I'm saving them a lot of time and money. Otherwise, they would never be able to understand each other, even if they spoke the same language. And then, sometimes you always think, especially when you're working as an interpreter, sometimes you wonder, would these people actually say those things to each other if they didn't go through an interpreter? Are they counting on me to filter some of the stuff that they're saying? Are they counting on me to making it more nicer, more palatable? Or when you're a translator, are they counting on me to edit the original while I'm translating the original to make and turning it into a language, a text in another language? So it makes you wonder if people are relying on us to be filters, and if they're relying on us to be their editor, their censor, or their helper in the communication process. So those are things that often go through our minds, and I'm sure that as interpreters, as translators, you must have wondered, they would never say this to each other if I wasn't there to filter it, or they would never write this, they would never send a letter like this if they didn't know that this was going to be for a translation. But, as language professionals, we're committed to the communication event. We're committed to our profession. We're committed to doing a good job. We want the two people to be able to speak to one another effectively. But because we're language professionals, we are as well committed to this communication event to go well. It's almost like, I like to compare translating and interpreting almost like, getting into translation or interpretation, almost like getting into a marriage. You are committed to your partner, but you're also committed to your marriage. You want your marriage to continue and evolve. When you're an interpreter, when you're a translator, you're committed to the work you're doing right now, but you also want translation to do well. You want interpreting to do well. You want your professions to be recognized, respected, and well valued in society as they should. So in that sense, you think, okay, now I can do anything. You're faced sometimes with difficult problems in translation and interpreting, and you say, I can do anything. I know I can translate anything. Are you convinced that you can translate anything? Or are you convinced that you can interpret anything?
No.
You sure? You're not convinced. You're not so sure.
I'm sure that I cannot translate everything.
Yeah. You're sure you cannot translate everything.
Everything.
There are things that are things like topics that you're not too familiar with. Is everything translatable?
No.
Yes. Yes. No. See.
Not in all languages. Not in all languages.
Not in all languages. See, that's where, translation, some people say, well, translation is an art. Translation is science. It's a science to the extent that we can teach it. We can break the translation process into steps and we can teach it. And there are tools and there are procedures and strategies and all that. It's an art, as you can see, because it depends. It depends largely on the languages involved. It depends largely on why someone is saying something X, for example, and you think, oh, I don't think I can translate this word for word, or I don't think I can interpret this without prefacing, saying something before I interpret it so that they can understand what I'm saying. So it's a little bit of art, a little bit of science, a little bit of both. I must confess something. I'm from the school of thought that everything can be translated. Otherwise, I wouldn't teach translation, right? I think that everything can be translated. It always depends why we're translating it. That's where I would go back. And sometimes you say, oh, we can't translate it, it's a joke. You know, it's a play on words, a joke. It won't work if I translate it. Well, if the person is telling you a joke, like the joke that the host was saying earlier, if that joke could be easily translatable into other languages because it's not focused on language. But if it's a play on words, you think, oh, the person that I'm interpreting for is trying to break the ice. They're trying to say something light and funny. So maybe I'll tell my own joke. This happened to a colleague of mine, an interpreter, who was a young interpreter, but I thought had an interesting strategy there, was interpreting the same speaker in the morning and the afternoon session. In the morning session, the speaker goes on and on and on, and then starts telling a joke, and then in the end, the interpreter is interpreting, and then in the end, the interpreter gets, and then the speaker gets to the joke, and the joke is not funny. Not that it's not translatable, it's just not funny. Boom, boom, nobody laughs. And then he moves on to his talk. In the afternoon, the speaker has not learned his lesson. He starts again with the same joke. The interpreter is clever, he said, now, the speaker is going to tell a joke, it's not very funny. But when I tell you, you should try to smile, or at least to applaud a little bit, because his goal is to break the ice. So half the room who didn't get the interpreting were like, and the other half that was, being interpreted for them. So the interpreter went beyond what the speaker was doing. It was a little bit better. So the poor speaker had no idea, completely oblivious of what was going on, but he was probably thankful that someone was smiling, someone was laughing because the ice was being broken. A little earlier I said, sometimes speakers would tell you things that they probably wouldn't tell naturally, or if there were a language barrier. When I was a young interpreter working in Whitehorse and Yukon, I was asked to interpret for a French speaker appearing before the Workers' Compensation Board. And according to the board, the person, the speaker, was ready to go back to work as long as he was taking his pills for pain management. But the person did not want to take pills, did not want to take this kind of medication, so ended up not wanting to return to work because he was in constant pain. And I could see that he was sort of playing a little bit with me. He could understand English, the speaker could understand English, but he was telling me things, and then he was looking at me like, how would you translate that? He was sort of testing me to see if I was going to be able to translate this. So at one point he turns to the board, and for those of you who understand French, especially Quebec French, will like this one. He said, "J'en veux pas de prise de pilule." So he cursed right in the middle of it. He said, "I don't want your pills," right? So I wasn't used to that at all. So, but I think I did a fairly, not a perfect job, but a fairly good job. I said, "I don't want your fucking pills." Which is not perfect, but you get the point. The panel members were kind of shocked, and then the conversation evolved from there. I'm not sure that that language would have been used if they had been able to speak to one another in their first language. But in that sense, I was able to, I could have just skipped over the effing part and still say that I don't want your pills. But when we're interpreting, when we're translating, what is important is, yes, the content, the meaning, but also sometimes the form has meaning. So it's important that the form also gets conveyed, or at least that, we don't do anything, we're not willful and intentional in blocking some of the content so that it looks cleaner or more polite or less offensive. In that sense, I thought it was important to show that the speaker was getting impatient and wanted to make a point, so fucking goes. So today I'll talk to you, this is my long introduction, 15 minutes. Today I'll talk to you a little bit more about our role as language professionals when we encounter things that we don't necessarily feel comfortable repeating or translating or transferring into another language. But I'll try to convince you that it is important to try to convey those things, and I'll give you a few strategies in order to help you do that as well, a little bit of practice. So you have to be comfortable saying, or at least saying in a professional setting, those words that you would not probably use in your personal life. So you have to be, we're language professionals, we should be able to use the full range of the two languages and the two cultures that we are working in. You should be able to use the full range, because if you're depriving yourself from part of the lexicon, you're really not using all the tools in the language that are at your availability. Just before we go, I don't know if you can see this, I'll read it for you, but I wanted you to sort of start testing your willingness to go a little bit farther in the use of language. So I know that you're all bilingual, you're all bicultural. I want to know if you feel, as an individual, not as a professional, but as an individual, do you feel comfortable discussing details about sexual intercourse with people of another gender, people of another generation, culture, economic status, in public? So would you stand on a street corner somewhere, talk about sexual intercourse with someone of another generation, for example? Talking about sexual intercourse with your children, your neighbor's children,
You'd be arrested.
your parents, your friend's parents, your boss, etc., etc., etc. Are you comfortable using offensive language, what some would consider offensive language, homophobic language, Islamophobic language, racist language? Are you comfortable using heteronormative, sexist language? Heteronormative is, assuming that a female will be married to a male and male be married to a female, for example. Or assuming that if someone has children, they must be with a partner of the other sex. Or sexist language, assuming that, for example, saying, when the doctor opened his practice, he hired a secretary who could do all the work, and she was able to do everything he couldn't do. This would be, even if we're talking about the hypothetical, this would be considered sexist language. If you're comfortable doing this, or are you comfortable making out of context references to bodily functions? So, for example, this muffin is fucking delicious, or tastes like shit. Are you comfortable? No. As an individual, as a professional now, because remember, as a professional, those aren't really your words. It's not really coming out of you, it's coming out of someone else. Are you able and comfortable to convey those words? And people nod, people say, who's comfortable doing this as a professional? Yeah. So who's not entirely comfortable doing this as a professional or saying those words? Not entirely. Yeah. There are things doesn't mean that you wouldn't do it, but you would do it and you think, or write it or say it and you think, I wish I didn't have to say that. But we have to. But we're professionals and we're going to be able to do it. So I'm going to try to help you make this a little bit easier. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today, definition of taboo. We'll go over taboo very quickly. We all know what taboo is. We'll talk about taboos and language, taboos and their impact, or how they could impact interpreting and translation. Strategies to process taboos, to translate them, to interpret them more comfortably for us. And then at the end, I'm saving a little bit of, if I have a little bit of time, I'm going to talk to you about a research project that I'm working on right now. We're working a colleague and I are working on the subtitling of the series Narcos. I don't know if you know Narcos on Netflix, the story of Pablo Escobar. There's a lot of language in there. And the subtitling is absolutely, the subtitling and the dubbing of the series, absolutely fantastic. A gold mine for someone doing research and translation studies. And then we'll move on to conclusion, and then it'll be saved from me in my foul language. So, taboos. Taboos are not to be confused, or cultural taboos certainly, are not to be confused with what we consider, what we call cultural etiquette. For example, you know, when I talk about cultural etiquette, I mean, for example, if I go to an event or meet someone I've never met before, and I introduce myself to someone, and I see the person is wearing a niqab, I might not extend my hand first. If she extends her hand, then I'm feeling it's like permission to shake hands. But I would not extend my hand first. That would be cultural etiquette. Something that I've learned. I'm from Rimouski, Quebec. We didn't know anything. You know, growing up, we thought everybody was just like us. And then I moved to Montreal, and I thought, wow, not everybody's like me. Okay, so it was a bit of an awakening, but it was good. So shaking hands, showing the sole of your feet, planting chopsticks in the bowl of rice, and those are things that you're not supposed to do unless you have to know. Standing above an elder, interrupting an elder, remain sitting down in the presence of dignitaries. In French, vous, tu, the usted, and tu in Spanish, same thing, when do you move from the formal to the informal? Some cultures have etiquette rules that are close to one another, so they're not really, there's no major clash between the two, but some are quite different. We can think about Canadian culture and US culture, or British culture and Canadian culture. We think we share a language. The culture is really quite different. Much more formal in Britain than we would be in Canada, and in Canada a little bit more formal than you will be. A little bit more formal or polite than you would be in the United States. It depends on what we consider to be polite. I had a friend once who said that, when you're in the UK, if you work in the UK, you'll start working with someone, you'll sit next to them, and after 1 year, they'll say, to you, would you like to have coffee during break? That's after 1 year. And after 2 years, they'll say, well, maybe we should go for lunch together today at the same time. This isn't a caricature, an exaggeration. And after 5 years, you may be able to go to a restaurant together in the evening, as colleagues. In California, you sit next to someone in your cubicle, and 5 minutes later, you're talking about each other's yeast infection. So it is no formality. This is it. So, why does it matter? Why should we care as language professionals about taboos? Because we're sitting on the fence of two cultures and two languages. We're bicultural, we're bilingual. We may be twice as exposed as the regular speaker to those taboos, and maybe twice as desensitized as the taboo. So sometimes we think, they're just using this as part of language. We don't really think of it as a taboo anymore, or we don't feel that we should or that we need to talk about taboos. But as professionals, we need to be able to talk about language and about intercultural communications as professionals, and we should care about taboos because there are, in my opinion, and I'm not the only reference on this, but there are ethical consequences. There could be practical consequences. We need to be able to identify taboos and identify strategies to translate them. And as professionals, we need to be able to prepare for it. So how do you prepare? When you're sent to an assignment on nuclear energy, you're going to read about nuclear energy. Well, why wouldn't you be familiar with, not unpleasant, but why would you not be familiar also with taboo language? So a little bit about taboos and what it is, what they are. They come from the Fijian taboo, T-E-B-U, which means forbidden. Definition of taboo is a social or religious custom forbidding or restricting. Restricting is a good, I like restricting more than forbidding, but restricting a particular practice or forbidding association with a particular person, place, or thing. That's an official definition. And then further definition I found is prohibition of an action on the belief that such behavior is either too sacred or dangerous. And then here, when we have the word belief, it also brings to mind the word superstition. Because we may be able to use certain taboo words if we counter them with something else. You know, cross our fingers, knock on wood, spit 3 times, there are ways to do the, or I don't forget what it is, like, do the horn like this, like this is not going to affect me because I'm doing this to counter the effect of the cultural taboo. There are universal taboos. Not all taboos are specific to cultures. There are universal taboos: incest, pedophilia, slavery. Those are things that we don't do because we just don't do them. There are some religious taboos. Of course, food taboos related to religion, menstruation, personal hygiene, also sometimes related to taboos in religion, personal grooming. Don't cut your hair, don't tweeze a single hair. Those things can be related to religious practices. Clothing, what you wear, what you not wear. Those are also related to cultural taboos as religious taboos. This is what I would call cultural taboos as well. But we'll get to language a little bit later. I divided cultural taboos from social taboos. Social taboos are things you do not know in your community because there are rules or things that you're not supposed to do. I'll give you a specific example. When I was working in Yukon as a translator and as an interpreter, I was also training interpreters in indigenous languages, and we encountered many barriers, many social taboos. For example, we had, not surprisingly, when you look at the crowd, language professions are not only for women, but you'd think that there's a rule against men being language professionals. There are a lot fewer men practicing as language. No, but look around. I'm not making it up. There are fewer men in the language profession than there are female. Men and women and female and men. And in Yukon, most of our interpreters, I would say 99% of our interpreters, were female. That posed a number of problems because there are certain things that females are not supposed to talk about with males. Now you think, okay, that's fine in theory or in everyday practice. But let's say you have a court case and a rape case comes up to court and you need an interpreter. Well, you call an interpreter, female interpreter comes up, and then there's a male in the accused box, and then they have to talk about sex with a member of the other sex. This does not go well. It does not go well because, yes, they will do the interpreting, but then they will be shunned by the community because they've broken the social rule. So how do we go around doing that? How do we go around, first of all, we try to find a gender congruent interpreter, and when it's not possible, then we have to talk to the elders of the community to make sure that that person is protected in that profession. Speaking in turns also was a bit of a difficulty with Indigenous interpreters in the North because you're not supposed to interrupt an elder. So when an elder was presenting a testimony in court, they could go on for a while, and the interpreter was not allowed to stop them, to do a proper consecutive. So the elder would go sometimes for 20 minutes. And then, that's called a long consecutive. But in court, every detail is important, so it's very difficult to do an efficient, a very efficient consecutive, when it's so long consecutive in court. So we had to come up with a scheme where explaining to the elder that it will have to be interrupted. And then the interpreter would just sit right next to them. We'd have the person presenting, testifying, and then the interpreter would be sit next to them and just squeeze their hand a little bit. But introducing that to the process made it look like the interpreter and the elder were sort of colluding. Yes, so the whole idea of neutrality, impartiality was kind of broken. So we had to come up with other codes, a wink, a movement of the head, I'm going to raise my head and then I'm going to start speaking, and then the elders were able to understand it. But we had to work with that. The clan system, there are two major clans in Yukon, the Crow and the Wolf clan, and usually when a crow does something for a wolf, or a wolf does something for a crow, there has to be some compensation. So if an interpreter, let's say from the wolf clan, interprets for a crow, the crow will have to pay something to the wolf. And it's something that we're not familiar with. So you would see in court, someone coming, being interpreted for, bringing a gift to the interpreter in public. And you'd say, oh, where's the impartiality? Where's the, what happens now? This had to be explained and justified, of course, before the courts. Cultural taboos, there are topics, I talked about topics earlier. Swearing in, we had a number of elders who did not want to be sworn in because they thought that swearing on the Bible meant cursing on the Bible. So there's, that the word swearing and cursing are very close in meaning, but swearing in is completely different. But the interpreters were not quite able to convey that difference to the elders, and they would put their hand on the Bible and say, now swear. No one would swear. So they would be sent directly, to jail for not having complied, for contempt of court. We had to work with that. There was not the vocabulary to deal with it. So just so you know, there are social taboos and cultural taboos of the social nature that are difficult. But we're going to talk about cultural taboos related to language. I'm going to go much faster now. I think of cultural taboos as they affect interpreters in the sense of the idea of language and culture are not, you cannot separate language from culture. A language and a culture have to go together. You may be able to interpret for British English, you may be able to interpret for American English, but you have to know the culture of the UK, you have to know the culture of America as well if you're going to do that in addition to Canadian English. So those two go together. So if we accept that language and culture are indivisible, translation and interpreting take place where at least two languages and two cultures meet. So we have to be able to do the transfer between the two. And if taboos are cultural in origin, they must be known to the interpreter, the translator, to be perceived, to be conveyed, and then to be avoided. Example of cultural language communities, or culture and language communities. The concept of culture in that sense is not the one that we're thinking of, with paintings and architecture. This is the concept of, characteristics that unite a group of people who share those characteristics in whole or in part. They can be related, people can be related to a given community because of the geography, where they are or where they're from, their economic features, certain economic classes, gender, or language. In those contexts, language-related cultural taboos can vary greatly from geography, so either they're traditions that are in a given country or brought over from a country into a new country. They could be professional taboos, socioeconomic taboos. When I say professional taboos, there are certain things that, as language professionals, we don't like to talk about, or we don't like. If someone speaks poorly or makes a lot of mistakes, like I make a lot of mistakes in English, but if someone makes a lot of mistakes in their own language, in their first language, people will go, you're not a language professional. You should be better than that. So this is a bit of a professional taboo. Women talk, men talk, queer talk, teen talk, those are I work with teenagers every day. They don't speak English the way their parents speak English. I don't speak English like that. You go like, okay, I'm so frustrated with this system, and it's so that's what I hear that all the time. So I'm sort of able to do it, but I don't like to do it, okay? Cultural taboos, they're topics and they're words, practices that are either acceptable or unacceptable in our culture. You know, the Disney quotation mark for each and every specific culture. The sources of taboo. What are the sources? Where do taboos come from? What are the biggest subjects or topics where the taboos come from? Well, blasphemy. What is blasphemy? Blasphemy is using either the name or the picture or representation of God out of context without respect. So that's considered blasphemy. Profanities. Profanities is a big category. It could be a lot of different things. I'm just going to add a list of profanities for you, but for example, I'm going to say, for example, in my home of Quebec, we use a lot of profanities when we speak. In a popular register, we love everything that has to do with the church in terms of, you know, to populate our language or vocabulary. And those swear words, those profanities, are very efficient in the language. It could be nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, it could be anything, really. They're very multi-purpose. You could make a whole sentence with only curse or obscenities, and people would sort of understand what you're saying. You could say, for example, ce style-là, je vais en crisser un tabarnak. I didn't say anything specific, but it really means that person I don't like, I'm going to slap him hard. And I did not say either slap or him, but I only use obscenity, not obscenities. I only use swear words, blasphemies. Not blasphemies, profanities. Cursing, you know, putting a curse on someone, that's another kind of taboo in the language. You know, I put a curse on you, I put a curse on you, I put a curse on you. Obscenities, using things that, you know, talking about body function, body parts, to curse, not to curse, but to express frustration or to call someone name. When I first started learning English, it was very shocking to me that you could call someone a specific body part. We don't have that in French. We do, but, you know, we don't really use that. And that it would be a very bad insult to call someone X. I don't have that in my register. And then are there, in name avoidance, just a small parenthesis here. There are cultures where you cannot use a person's name. For example, a daughter-in-law cannot use her father-in-law's name in the language. So when that person gets married, they cannot use the father-in-law's name or any word that rhymes with the father-in-law's name. So they have to avoid called name avoid. They have to avoid everything. So they have to be very creative. There's a whole register of vocabulary that are meant to avoid speaking that person's name. Out of respect, out of respect. I don't know, you must have other examples as well from your own culture, your own languages that you translate to and from. Ethical consideration, why do we care as translators and as interpreters? We care because we're supposed to be translating. We're supposed to be interpreting in all circumstances. We have to be accurate and faithful. We also have, in terms of, I listed here all the tenets of ethics. You know, one from HIN, the standard guide for community interpreting practice. I also added some of ITIO that were not in the HIN, or not specific in the HIN. So accurately and fidelity, confidentiality, impartiality, respect for persons, maintenance of role boundaries, accountability, professionalism, continued competence. And then what I added from the ATIO Code of Ethics is scope of practice. You only do what you're able to do. If you don't know anything about medicine and you're asked to go to the doctor with a patient, you should be able to say no. I'm not going to be the best interpreter for this assignment. If no one else is going, yeah, okay. But I'm not the best person to do this. Remember this, the scope of practice. I'll come back to this later. Conflict of interest was clear. Non-discrimination, professional and social boundaries, and then image of the profession. We have to be good representatives of our own profession. Do I only have 5 minutes?
No, 8 minutes.
Okay, very well. Taboos are not always taboos. You know, we're not supposed to talk about body parts here because You're not supposed to talk about body parts. But in the doctor's office, of course you're going to talk about body parts, body functions. Sacrilegious, you're not supposed to talk about parts of, for example, in my case, the parts of the church. But unless you're in church, you're going to have to talk about church and church parts in church. Sometimes also taboos are not used as taboos if you want. They're more, in some cases, in the case of patients with Tourette syndrome and coprolalia, they will be using profanities uncontrollably. It's a nervous condition. And of course, you don't have to interpret or translate all of that, but a doctor should be able to recognize that without you having to repeat everything that is being said. Sometimes we also use taboos for rhetorical purposes, and that's, we have to be able to recognize the form and the form and be able to translate it as well. I'm going to move a little bit faster. So there are different strategies to interpret taboo. Whether you interpret taboo or say taboo A, do taboo A, something that is sort of equivalent in the other language. They refer to this, we have a similar or identical swear word or obscenity in the other language, we're going to use it. Taboo A, for taboo to taboo prime, so you don't really have the same taboo, but you're going to use something that is similar. You're going to use something that is very close or would be equally forceful. I'm going to use a euphemism. Euphemism is a softer form of a taboo. And then you're going to say, well, it's not quite the way it was, but it's very close. They'll get the point, but they might think that the person did not use a real taboo word, but I'll be able to get away with it. It's not really essential that I swear here. I can use something that is a little softer. Or then you just avoid it. You don't say anything. That's also, it may work for certain circumstances, but as they keep calm, ignore and just carry on. I give you an example from Canadian French. What I used earlier with the statement that my guy at Workers' Comp said, "J'en veux pas de vos crises de pilule." So I don't want your Christ pills. This is, if I translate it literally. You can't translate that literally, it means nothing in English. So what I had done was number 2, but number 1 would have been maybe closer. I don't want your goddamn pills. That had been closer. What I said is, I don't want your fucking pills, which was similar. They got the point. Trust me, the panel members got the point. Euphemism would be, I don't want your friggin' pills or your flipping pills. We're just changing the word into something a little bit more. Or your darn pills. This would be a little bit. Your bloody pills. So we're cursing, but using something quite more palatable. Avoidance is, I just don't want your pills. And compensation is something that we should be able to think about. We do that in interpreting when, let's say you miss something in the beginning of a sentence and then you start the other sentence, you're able to, especially in simultaneous, you're able to fit it in the second sentence, you sort of compensate for it. Same thing, we do the same thing in translation sometimes. So, I am mad and I don't want your pills. That's a way of compensating. You convey that there's some frustration in the speaker's voice and it should be recognized. Now, if you use French from France, I'm using the same sentence, but I'm changing it instead of crise de pilule to putain de pilule. Putain de pilule. This is very French. Putain means whore. So I do not want your whore pills. Makes no sense. You can't do that. You can say that in English, it means nothing. So we don't have. So whore is not a swear word. It's not a great word. Not a swear word in English. We can't use it taboo for taboo. So the same thing, fucking, frigging, flipping, bloody pills, exactly. Those would be possible. And I changed the compensation I changed as well. I don't want your pills, and this process is making me very angry or frustrated. So we could convey the meaning in another way. I think I'm going to skip this one because, and I can send the presentation to people if they're interested in it. I think I'd like to, yes, this week I'm just going to conclude with my example from Narcos. Most people familiar with Narcos. Narcos is the story of Pablo Escobar. It in the original languages in which the dialogues would have taken place. It's not, I would call it a bilingual series, taking place in Colombian Spanish and American English. Those are the two languages. So it's a bilingual series. If you don't understand one or the other language, you have access to subtitling. But this is, you know, if you go a little bit deeper, in our study we're looking at 3 languages, Spanish, English, and French. We identified 7 possible audiences. So bilingual audience, they don't need subtitling, they don't need dubbing, they're just watching it the way it is. Spanish speakers who don't speak English will look for the subtitling in English. English speakers who don't speak Spanish will look for the subtitling in English. I said Spanish, English. Spanish speakers who don't speak English and don't want subtitles will look at the dub version where everything is in Spanish, and there are a lot of problems that come up with that issue. English speakers who don't speak Spanish and don't want subtitles are dubbed in English. And then there's French. The whole series can be either subtitled, is available subtitled in French, or dubbed in French. You can watch the whole thing with the French accent. And it's not quite the same as the original. All right, so we looked at that, and then we came up with a series of examples taken from 2 specific episodes. And on the left-hand side, I'm showing you the original passage, how it was subtitled, and then what the French did, just to give you an idea what. Yeah, so weird shit became cosas raras. I don't know, the Spanish speakers in the audience will tell me if it's. No, I think there is a word for shit in Spanish. You're just not using it there. It may not be appropriate, but I think it could have been. And then in French it becomes truc bizarre, which is very close to what the Spanish have done as well. Cosas raras, truc bizarre. It's a little bit unusual. Fucking lifer. In the passage that the Murphy tells Javi, who's going to go to appear before the board in Miami, Javi, you're a fucking lifer. Meaning, you'll go through this, you'll come back, you know, you're in this job forever. In Spanish, they say, te darán perpetua. They will put you in jail for life, which is quite a bit stronger. It's not exactly what was said. And in French, indéboulonnable, meaning, you know, it's a very French from France expression, meaning you're there, you're built into the furniture, basically. They won't be able to get rid of you. Fuck you comes up many times. Usually, mete a la mierda, and which is, there's a word for shit in Spanish. And then, batfefut in French is go get fucked. Batfefut. And perico is a nice euphemism for cocaine. I thought it was a euphemism, and then from euphemism they went for the real word. They said, no, cocaine and coke in French, la coke. La coke, of course. Hijo de puta becomes son of a bitch, which is, I think, perfect. And then French fumier, which is animal manure. Yeah. Marica, what a fantastic insult. Maricón, marica, gran marica later on. It is basically the equivalent would be faggot, right? Fag or faggot. And in English it becomes stupid. And in French it becomes con, which is sometimes understood as stupid, but it really refers to female body parts, right? Gran marica becomes, talking about Julius Caesar, gran marica. Gran marica, motherfucker, in English. And in French, very flat, nothing, mec, a mec, which is like a guy, a regular guy. Yeah, there's a great deal lost in the translation. Bullshit. Bullshit is a good one. Panta mierda, I would say quite close. Connerie, stupidities. Silly things. Connerie. Not quite. Malparidos. Malparidos comes up a lot. So there's a bastards, you know. And in French, nothing. We have them too. And we have the word for that. But we don't use it here. One of my favorite though is gonorrhea, malparido. I mean, this is like a real thing. Malparido is nothing. Gonorrhea, malparido. We would never think of calling someone a disease. But in English, the subtitle says gonorrhea, bastard, son of a bitch. Boom, boom, boom. 3 things. Quite strong. And in French, nothing. In French, no. It's not good, but we get the point. But we don't say it. It's very interesting. It would be interesting to go deeper and say, why did they run out of space? Because with the subtitling, but when they're speaking, they have to say something. No. That is skip. And Taboo words on the phone. Gonorrhea, malparino. No. That doesn't work. Anyway, in conclusion, taboos are a part of language, whether we want it or not, and they can come up when you least expect it. They're meaningful, they mean something, they should be conveyed across language and culture whenever possible, with proper strategy. You have to use your common sense. There are limitations that can impact translation strategies. What are you going to be able to do in a social context, or should you be explaining what you're going to be doing as a professional? There are ethical, professional, and practical aspects to consider in the translation of taboo languages. You have to convey the meaning. Professionally, you have to be respectful, you have to reflect well on your profession, but you also have to be able to recognize the taboo in both languages and both cultures so that you can identify it and then be able to convey it. Ethically, we're supposed to, as a chaos, we may be able to decline the translation or interpreting assignment, and I know that agencies won't like me saying that. But you should be able to at least say, well, on this topic, and for example, in nuclear energy, I can't do this. Well, if you know that you're going to be interpreting for a rape case, you're going to be using that kind of language in the rape case for sure. And if you feel like you cannot do justice to the case, you should be able to say, I think someone else should be able to do this better than I am. And if no one else is able to do it, then you do the best you can. At all times, we must remember our social role as language professionals. We're there to bridge gaps. We're not there to create gaps. We're there to be helpful. And I thank you for your attention and your patience.